A new beginning. Jack Henderson's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of his old pickup as he wound his way through the quiet streets of Cedar Grove, a town that seemed suspended in time. It was late autumn, and the golden afternoon light cast long shadows across the road, mirroring the doubts that lingered in Jack's mind. A 52-year-old contractor, Jack wasn't the kind of man who dwelled on uncertainties, but today was different. Today, he was about to bring 3 young lives into his home and into his heart. The boys, Noah, Kyle, and Martin, were in the back seat, silent and somber. They had lost their parents in a tragic car accident just 2 months prior, and Jack had been present at that last moment of normalcy in their lives. He'd been renovating their family home, a job that had initially seemed ordinary until he'd grown attached to the curious boys who'd watched him work. Little Martin, just 7, had been fascinated with his tools, while 8-year-old Kyle would pester him with questions about how things worked. Noah, the eldest at 10, often sat back, observing quietly, as though absorbing the answers in his own way. But that had been before. Now the boys were orphans, their worlds turned upside down in an instant, and Jack was the only person left in their lives willing to take on the role of their guardian. He glanced at the manila envelope lying on the passenger seat, filled with adoption papers and legal documents. It felt surreal, this new responsibility he was taking on, a responsibility his late wife, Melinda, would have embraced. They had always dreamed of having children, but it had never come to pass. Now, as fate would have it, he was stepping into a role he had long thought impossible. He could still recall the looks he had received at the courthouse when he first expressed his intent to adopt the boys. Cedar Grove wasn't exactly progressive when it came to issues of race or family dynamics, and a white man adopting 3 black boys wasn't a decision the community readily understood. Whispers followed him at church, the hardware store, and even his favorite diner. Mrs. Thompson, his elderly neighbor, had peered at him with an expression of barely disguised horror when he mentioned his decision. Jack knew what people thought, but he also knew what felt right. These boys needed a home, a family, and he had one to give. As they pulled up to his modest 2-story house on Maple Street, Jack turned to the boys, offering them an encouraging smile. "Well, boys," he said, his voice gentle but steady, "we're home." The words seemed to hover in the air, heavy with new meaning. Kyle, typically the outspoken one, glanced at his brothers before murmuring, "It's big." Jack chuckled softly, trying to lighten the moment. The house wasn't grand by any means, but it was warm, sturdy, and filled with memories of the life he built with Melinda. He led the boys up the narrow path to the front door, watching as they stayed close together, each clutching a small, worn backpack. Inside, the living room was simple, filled with second-hand furniture and a few personal touches. An old leather couch, a coffee table Jack had crafted years ago, and family photos on the walls, mostly of Jack and Melinda in their younger years, smiling and carefree. Jack made a mental note to update the photos. This was their home now, and he wanted them to feel it. "Would you like to see your rooms?" he asked, noticing how the boys' eyes widened. They exchanged glances, clearly surprised by the offer. Jack took it as a good sign. He guided them upstairs, showing them each room he had prepared with basic furniture and fresh linens. Each room was modest, painted in soft colors, with a small bed, a dresser, and a desk for schoolwork. Noah was the first to venture into his room, his fingers tracing the edge of the wooden desk thoughtfully. Kyle lingered in the doorway, looking uncertain, while little Martin hesitated by the bed, glancing up at Jack with eyes that seemed too wise for his 7 years. Jack crouched down to meet their eyes, his joints protesting the movement, but he wanted to make sure they understood. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said gently. "It's new, maybe even a little scary. But I want you to know, you're safe here. This is your home now, and you're not alone." He hesitated, his voice thickening with emotion. "We'll figure things out together, one step at a time. That's what families do." A long silence followed as the boys absorbed his words. Jack watched as their expressions shifted, the initial uncertainty giving way to something softer, something closer to hope. For the first time, he felt a flicker of reassurance. He didn't know what the road ahead held, but he knew he wouldn't face it alone. They were in this together. That evening, they sat down for their first meal as a family. Jack had spent the afternoon preparing one of Melinda's old recipes, hoping it would bring a sense of warmth and comfort. The boys were quiet, still cautious, but Jack didn't mind the silence. He knew that trust would take time to build, especially with children who had already endured more loss than anyone should. As they ate, he noticed Noah stealing glances at him, as though trying to size him up, to understand who this man was who had taken them in. After dinner, they settled in the living room, and Jack suggested watching a movie. He let the boys pick, and they eventually agreed on an animated classic that had them laughing and leaning in as the story unfolded. Jack watched them out of the corner of his eye, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and hope. There was a sense of peace in that room, a tentative but promising beginning. When it was time for bed, Jack tucked each boy in, a gesture that felt both unfamiliar and deeply satisfying. Little Martin clutched his new blanket with a shy smile. Kyle muttered a soft good night, and Noah, the eldest, simply nodded, his eyes betraying a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. Jack paused at Noah's door, wanting to say something, but instead, he just squeezed the boy's shoulder gently. Later, as he lay in bed, Jack found himself staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with the enormity of what lay ahead. He thought of Melinda and the life they had planned together, and how different this new chapter would be. He knew the road wouldn't be easy. He knew they would face challenges, both from within and from the outside world. But he also knew that he wouldn't have chosen any other path. For the first time in years, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reason to move forward, a chance to give love and guidance to those who needed it most. The moon cast a soft glow through his window, and as he drifted off to sleep, he whispered a quiet prayer for strength and wisdom. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he was ready to face it. This was his family now, and they were worth every challenge, every sacrifice. As he closed his eyes, he felt a peace settle over him, a sense of rightness that he hadn't felt in a long time. They had a long journey ahead, but tonight, they had taken the first step. And sometimes, Jack thought, that first step was all it took. Growing pains. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting warm light on the worn oak table where Jack sat sipping his coffee. He watched the boys carefully, each of them moving cautiously around the kitchen as they prepared for the day. Noah, the oldest, was already showing signs of maturity beyond his years, helping Kyle and Martin pour cereal without spilling, glancing at Jack every so often to see if he was doing something wrong. Jack kept his expression relaxed, hoping to ease the lingering tension that still filled the air. It was only their second morning together, but Jack could already sense the weight of the boys' unspoken fears. "Good morning, boys," Jack greeted, trying to sound casual. "Did you sleep all right?" Kyle shrugged, mumbling something under his breath, while Martin, his big brown eyes looking up at Jack, gave a small nod. Noah, the most reserved, simply nodded without meeting Jack's gaze. Jack reminded himself to be patient. Trust would take time, more time than a couple of quiet breakfasts or reassuring words could provide. "Today's a special day," Jack announced, hoping to lift their spirits. "We're gonna take a trip to town. I thought we'd go shopping for some things to decorate your rooms. Whatever you want. A new comforter, posters, maybe some books or toys." Kyle perked up at the idea. "Can I get one of those glow-in-the-dark stars for my ceiling?" he asked, a hint of excitement finally breaking through his shy exterior. Jack smiled, nodding. "You bet. Anything you want to make it feel like your space." The boys exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Jack knew they were still processing this new reality. Cedar Grove was a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone else's business, and he knew taking the boys out would invite curious stares. But Jack was determined to let the boys feel they belonged, no matter what anyone else thought. After breakfast, they piled into Jack's truck, and he drove them to a local department store. As they walked in, Jack couldn't help but notice the glances from passers-by, the quick, assessing looks that lingered a moment too long. But he forced himself to ignore them, focusing instead on the boys as they explored the aisles, gradually letting their guard down. They moved cautiously at first, as though afraid they might break something, but slowly, excitement began to replace the initial hesitance. Kyle was the first to select something, a bright blue comforter with a racing car print. "Can I have this one, Mr. Henderson?" he asked, looking up at Jack with a hopeful expression. Jack knelt down to meet Kyle's eyes. "Kyle, you don't need to call me Mr. Henderson," he said gently. "You can just call me Jack if you want, or, well, whatever feels right." Kyle looked uncertain, glancing at his brothers for guidance. Noah, ever the protector, gave him a slight nod, and Kyle managed a small smile. "Thanks, Jack. That's the spirit," Jack replied, ruffling Kyle's hair, feeling a rush of affection for the boy. Noah was more hesitant, picking out items with a careful, almost guarded deliberation. He eventually chose a set of plain sheets, a couple of books, and a poster of a basketball player Jack didn't recognize. Jack sensed that Noah was testing him, seeing how far Jack's acceptance would go, as though he couldn't quite believe that Jack's generosity was genuine. Martin, the youngest, clung to a small stuffed bear he found in the toy aisle. Jack noticed the way he held it close to his chest, and something in him broke a little. He wondered if Martin had lost a similar toy in the aftermath of the accident, or if this small comfort was something new, something to cling to in a world that had changed so quickly. Jack didn't say anything, but he made sure Martin knew he could keep the bear. They left the store with bags of supplies, the boys carrying their own bags as if each item was a precious treasure. As they walked back to the truck, Jack noticed some familiar faces watching them from across the parking lot. A couple of men from the church, neighbors who'd known him for years, were shaking their heads, whispering among themselves. Jack knew what they thought, that he was meddling in something he didn't understand, that he was inviting trouble. "Don't mind them," Jack said softly to Noah, who had noticed the stares too. "People like to talk, but they don't know us. They don't know what we're building." Noah's expression softened a little, a hint of trust glimmering in his eyes. "Okay," he whispered. Back home, Jack helped the boys arrange their new things, letting them place posters on the walls, rearrange furniture, and settle into their spaces however they liked. By the time they were finished, the rooms looked transformed, filled with little touches of personality, bright colors, stuffed animals, books, and posters. Each boy's room was different, yet they all shared a sense of warmth and individuality that hadn't been there before. The next few weeks fell into a pattern as Jack tried to establish a routine. The boys attended the local school, and though they had each other, adjusting wasn't easy. They were met with a mix of curiosity and standoffishness from the other students, who, like many of the adults in Cedar Grove, weren't used to seeing a family like theirs. Jack did his best to support the boys, spending time in the evenings helping with homework, cooking dinners, and getting to know them better. He was patient with their silences, understanding that trust couldn't be rushed. Despite the challenges, little moments of connection began to emerge. Jack found himself sharing stories of Melinda and the life they had hoped to build together, and the boys listened, asking questions here and there, as though trying to piece together who this man was who had taken them in. Jack shared stories of his own childhood, his love for woodworking, and his dreams of starting a family. Dreams that, until recently, had seemed all but impossible. One evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, Noah turned to Jack with a serious expression. "Why did you take us in?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question was one Jack had expected, but hearing it aloud still brought a lump to his throat. He met Noah's gaze, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Because you needed a family, Noah. And well, I needed one too. I can't replace your mom and dad, but I can be here for you. For all of you. We're family now, and that means we look out for each other." Noah was silent, digesting Jack's words. Slowly, he nodded, the faintest hint of understanding in his eyes. Over time, the boys started opening up more, sharing pieces of themselves in small, hesitant steps. Kyle showed Jack his drawings, his sketches of superheroes and cars that filled pages of his notebook. Martin, who had begun calling Jack Papa, in soft, shy tones, shared his favorite stories and would often sit beside Jack, watching him work on small projects around the house. And Noah, still guarded but warming, started to trust Jack with his worries about school, his frustrations, and even his hopes. But as they grew closer, the outside world continued to intrude. One Sunday after church, Mrs. Thompson stopped by, her expression stern. "Jack," she said, her voice a whisper tinged with disapproval, "don't you think you're making things hard on yourself? People talk, you know." Jack looked her square in the eye, his voice firm. "I'm doing what's right, Mrs. Thompson. They're my family now, and that's all that matters." As the weeks passed, Jack realized that this family they were building was more than a responsibility or an act of kindness. It was a calling, a second chance for him, and a chance at healing for the boys. They were navigating a world that didn't always understand them, facing whispered prejudices and questions they couldn't control. But within the walls of their little home on Maple Street, they were building something strong and real, a love and resilience that no one could take from them. One night, as he tucked Martin into bed, the little boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with a trust Jack had only dreamed of seeing. "Good night, Papa," he whispered, clutching his stuffed bear. Jack's heart swelled with emotion, and as he turned off the light, he knew that, despite the doubts and whispers, he had made the right choice. They were a family now, in every way that mattered, and together they would face whatever came next. Weathering the storm. Winter settled over Cedar Grove, casting a quiet chill across the town and blanketing the world in a muted, peaceful gray. Jack found himself grateful for the season, which brought a certain calm to his days with Noah, Kyle, and Martin. The cold kept everyone inside, huddled around the fireplace or buried under blankets on the worn couch as they watched old movies and sipped hot cocoa. The boys were growing comfortable in their new home, their laughter filling the rooms that had once been too quiet. The town, however, remained restless, unwilling to accept this new family as quickly as Jack had hoped. One snowy afternoon, Jack received a call from the principal of the boys' school. He had known that their adjustment at school was challenging, but the call made his heart sink. "Mr. Henderson," Principal Lawson began, her tone a mixture of warmth and concern, "I'm calling to let you know that there's been a situation with Noah." Jack's grip tightened on the phone. "Is he all right?" "He's fine, but there was an incident at recess. Some of the other boys were teasing him, saying things, cruel things about your family." Noah defended himself, but the situation got physical. Jack's jaw clenched. "I see. I'll be down there as soon as I can." He bundled up and drove to the school, the old truck's heater blasting as he tried to keep himself calm. When he arrived, he found Noah sitting outside the principal's office, his face set in a mask of defiance, though Jack could see the hurt behind his eyes. "Hey, buddy," Jack greeted softly, sitting down next to him. "You okay?" Noah didn't answer at first, his gaze fixed on the floor. But after a moment he whispered, "They said we weren't a real family. They said I didn't belong with you." Jack's heart broke a little. He knew children could be cruel, especially in a small town like Cedar Grove, where difference was met with suspicion. He put a comforting arm around Noah's shoulders, feeling the boy lean into him just slightly. "They don't know what they're talking about, Noah," Jack said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Family is about love, not about what people look like or what they think. You Kyle and Martin, you're my family. No one can change that. Noah looked up at him, searching his face as though trying to find the truth in Jack's words. Slowly, he nodded, a flicker of trust returning to his eyes. Together, they met with Principal Lawson, who assured Jack that the school would address the bullying issue, though her look of sympathy hinted at the reality that this wouldn't be an isolated incident. Jack knew he couldn't shield the boys from every harsh word or cruel look, but he vowed to do his best to make sure they knew they had a place where they belonged. When they returned home, Jack decided they needed a distraction. Snow had piled up around the house, blanketing the yard, and turning it into a wonderland. He dug out a pair of old sleds he had stored in the garage and called the boys outside, hoping a bit of fun would lift their spirits. They bundled up in mismatched hats, gloves, and scarves, and Jack led them to the small hill behind the house. Martin's eyes sparkled with excitement, and even Kyle, still quiet after hearing about the incident with Noah, managed to smile. Jack took a seat on one of the sleds, gesturing for the boys to join him. "All right," Jack announced, his voice playful. "Let's see if I still remember how to do this." They hurtled down the hill, the cold wind whipping past them as laughter echoed through the air. Jack's heart lifted as he watched the boys, their worries forgotten in the thrill of the moment. They spent hours outside, making snow angels, building snow forts, and staging snowball fights until their cheeks were red and their hands numb. When they finally trudged back inside, Jack made them hot cocoa, and they huddled around the fireplace, wrapped in blankets, sharing stories and jokes. That night, as Jack tucked each boy into bed, he saw a renewed sense of peace in their faces. They were safe here, surrounded by warmth and love. And for now, that was enough. But as the weeks passed, the weight of Cedar Grove's judgment grew heavier. Jack had always known that people were wary of his unconventional family, but he hadn't expected the subtle ostracism that followed. Parents at the boys' school avoided him at drop-off, their conversations stopping abruptly when he approached. Old friends seemed to grow distant, their greetings shorter, their smiles strained. One day, Jack stopped by the local hardware store to pick up supplies for a project he and Noah were working on, an old bookshelf they were restoring for his room. Jack was greeted by Carl, the store owner, who had known him for years. But as they spoke, Carl's gaze kept drifting over Jack's shoulder, toward the door. Finally, Carl cleared his throat, his voice dropping to a cautious tone. "Jack, can I speak frankly with you?" Jack tensed, bracing himself. "Of course, Carl. Go ahead. You know folks around here. They're not used to seeing a family like yours." Carl began, scratching his chin. "They're concerned. They're saying it's not. Well, it's not natural, what you're doing." Jack felt a surge of anger rise within him. Natural. Those boys needed a home, Carl. They lost their family. They're good kids. Why should anyone care what our family looks like? Carl shifted uncomfortably, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I know you mean well, Jack. I just thought you should know. People are talking. Maybe, for your own good, you might want to keep a low profile. Don't bring the boys around town so much. Give folks time to adjust." Jack was silent for a moment, struggling to contain his frustration. He knew Carl was only repeating the town's opinions, not his own. But it didn't make it any easier to hear. "I'm not going to hide my family, Carl," Jack said finally, his voice steady. "They're my boys. They deserve to be treated like anyone else." He left the store without another word, his heart heavy. Cedar Grove had always been home, a place where he built a life with Melinda, a place filled with memories. But now it felt different, as though the town itself were pushing back against him, against this new life he was trying to create. That night, after the boys had gone to bed, Jack sat by the fire, staring into the flames as doubts crept into his mind. Was he doing the right thing? Was he being selfish, dragging the boys into a life where they would always feel like outsiders? He thought of Melinda, of the quiet strength she had always shown, her unwavering belief in doing the right thing even when it was hard. He imagined what she would say if she were here, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he couldn't change Cedar Grove overnight, but he could give the boys a foundation strong enough to weather the storm. They might not always feel accepted here, but they would always have a place to belong, a home, a father, and brothers who loved them. In the following weeks, Jack threw himself into creating that foundation. He taught Noah how to sand and polish wood, a task that seemed to calm the boy and give him a sense of pride in his work. Together, they restored the old bookshelf, sanding down the rough edges and painting it a rich, warm brown. It wasn't perfect, but when they were done, Noah ran his hands over the smooth wood with a look of quiet satisfaction. With Kyle, Jack spent time drawing and coloring, encouraging his budding artistic talent. He even cleared out a space in the garage for Kyle to paint, setting up an easel and brushes, giving him a place to create without fear of judgment. And with Martin, Jack shared stories of his own childhood, teaching him to play checkers, letting him win more often than not, and listening as Martin talked about the things that mattered to him. Slowly, Jack watched as the boys settled into their new lives. They still faced challenges at school, and the town's judgment hadn't softened, but within the walls of their home, they were building something real, something no one else could take away. One evening, as they sat together around the dinner table, Jack looked at each of them, his heart swelling with pride. They had been through so much, and yet here they were, laughing, sharing stories, leaning on each other in ways he hadn't thought possible. "You know," Jack said, his voice quiet, "I'm proud of each one of you. I know it's been tough, and there are folks who don't understand us, but what matters is right here, at this table. We're a family, no matter what anyone else says." Noah, who had grown increasingly protective of his younger brothers, nodded solemnly. "We don't need them to understand. We have each other." Jack felt a surge of pride and gratitude. They might not be accepted by Cedar Grove, but they had created something stronger, a bond that was as enduring as the love he had shared with Melinda. Together, they would face the world, one day at a time, knowing they were not alone. And for Jack, that was more than enough. The weight of the world. Spring arrived in Cedar Grove with a slow, quiet thaw. The snow melted, giving way to patches of green that dotted the yard, and wildflowers began to peek through the damp earth. Jack could feel the change in the air, a warmth that breathed life back into the town, and he hoped, into the hearts of those who still eyed his family with suspicion. For the boys, the new season brought a welcome distraction. They spent hours outdoors, playing tag in the yard, climbing the old oak tree, and collecting rocks and sticks that somehow seemed precious to them. Jack watched them with a bittersweet pride, knowing that while they were growing comfortable, the world around them hadn't grown any kinder. One Saturday afternoon, the boys begged Jack to take them to the town's annual spring festival, an event filled with carnival games, food stalls, and music. It was a tradition in Cedar Grove, one that he and Melinda had attended every year. For Jack, it was a chance to let the boys enjoy something normal, to give them a slice of joy outside their small world at home. He hesitated, but when he saw the eager light in Martin's eyes, the hopeful glances from Noah and Kyle, he couldn't say no. "All right, boys, let's go," Jack said with a smile, and they cheered, rushing to the truck, as if they couldn't wait another second. The festival grounds were lively, filled with the sound of laughter, the smell of popcorn and fried dough, and the bright colors of balloons and streamers. The boys darted from one booth to the next, their excitement contagious. Jack kept a close eye on them, his heart lifting as he watched them giggle and race each other, their worries momentarily forgotten. But Cedar Grove wasn't ready to forget. As they moved through the crowds, Jack could feel the familiar stares, the whispers that followed them. He saw old friends exchange glances, their smiles thin and forced when they greeted him, their eyes lingering on the boys as though they were something to be dissected. Jack's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to focus on the boys, determined not to let the town's narrow-mindedness ruin their day. They stopped at a booth where kids could win prizes by knocking down stacks of cans with a baseball. Kyle took a shot, his aim precise, and knocked down every can on his first try. The booth operator, a burly man with a grizzled beard, raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "Nice throw, kid," he said, handing Kyle a small stuffed bear as a prize. Kyle's face lit up with pride, and Jack couldn't help but grin, clapping him on the shoulder. But as they moved to the next booth, Jack caught a snippet of conversation from a couple standing nearby. "That's Henderson with those boys, isn't it? I still don't understand why he'd do it. He's inviting trouble, you know. You can't just take kids like that and expect things to be normal." The words hung in the air, stinging Jack more than he cared to admit. He glanced down to see Noah's face tense, his jaw clenched as he looked away, pretending not to hear. Jack's heart ached for him, for all of them, knowing that they were too young to carry the weight of the town's prejudice. He wanted to protect them, to shield them from every harsh word, every doubting look. But he knew he couldn't. All he could do was be there, to remind them that they had someone who loved them, even if the world didn't understand. They continued to the food stalls, where Jack bought them funnel cakes, a sticky, sweet treat that left powdered sugar dusting their fingers and lips. For a while, they forgot about the whispers, their laughter filling the space between them as they ate. But as they moved toward the music stage, where a local band was performing, they were stopped by a woman Jack recognized from church, Mrs. Ellison, a tall, severe woman with a sharp gaze that had only grown sharper since Jack had adopted the boys. "Jack," she said, her voice cold as she looked him over, then cast a judgmental eye at the boys. "I see you've brought your family." Jack felt his patience wear thin. He met her gaze, refusing to back down. "Yes, Mrs. Ellison. These are my sons, and we're here to enjoy the festival, just like everyone else." She raised an eyebrow, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Well, I suppose it's commendable, what you're trying to do. But Cedar Grove is a small town, Jack. People talk. There are concerns about the boys fitting in here, about how this will affect them, and you." Jack felt his temper rising, but before he could respond, Noah stepped forward, his chin held high. "We're fine, ma'am. We're just as much a family as anyone else here." Mrs. Ellison looked taken aback, clearly not expecting Noah to defend himself. She gave Jack a final, disapproving look before turning away, her posture stiff. Jack felt a surge of pride as he placed a hand on Noah's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Thanks, Noah," Jack said softly. Noah shrugged, but Jack could see the tension in his face, the quiet anger simmering beneath the surface. "I don't get why people can't just let us be," he muttered. Jack knelt down so he was eye level with Noah, his voice gentle but firm. "People don't always understand what's different, and that can make them afraid. But that doesn't make them right. We know who we are, and that's what matters." Noah looked at him for a long moment, the tension in his face softening just a bit. "Yeah, I guess." The rest of the afternoon passed without incident, and when they finally returned home, the boys were exhausted but content, their earlier excitement lingering in the air. Jack helped them get ready for bed, listening as they recounted their favorite parts of the day, the games they'd played, the prizes they'd won. It was moments like this, these quiet, happy moments, that reminded Jack why he had chosen this path, despite the challenges. But Cedar Grove wasn't done testing him. The next week, Jack received a letter from the local school board, requesting a meeting. When he arrived, he was greeted by Principal Lawson, who looked visibly uncomfortable, and two members of the school board, Mr. Simmons and Mrs. Graves, both of whom wore expressions of polite detachment. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Henderson," Principal Lawson began, her voice trained. "We wanted to discuss some concerns that have been brought to our attention regarding the boys' adjustment here in Cedar Grove." Jack felt his heart sink. He knew where this was going. Concerns? What kind of concerns? Mr. Simmons cleared his throat, his voice clipped. There have been complaints from other parents about incidents involving your sons. Nothing serious, of course, but parents are worried that the boys aren't fitting in well. They're concerned about the impact on their own children. Jack's jaw tightened. My boys aren't causing trouble. If anything, they're the ones who've had to deal with being picked on and excluded. Mrs. Graves looked at him with a sympathetic but dismissive smile. We understand, Mr. Henderson, but these things take time, and we want what's best for all the children. Perhaps a private school, somewhere they can get more specialized attention, would be a better fit. Jack could hardly believe what he was hearing. He knew what they were suggesting, trying to push his boys out, to make them someone else's problem. No, Jack said firmly, his voice steady. My sons belong here, just like every other child. They have a right to an education, and they have a right to be part of this community. I'm not moving them. The board members exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by his refusal to back down. Principal Lawson looked relieved, though she quickly masked it. Of course, Mr. Henderson. We'll continue to work with the boys and support them however we can. Jack left the meeting with his head held high, determined to protect his family, no matter what the town thought. But the weight of Cedar Grove's judgment felt heavier than ever, pressing down on him like a burden he couldn't shake. That evening, he gathered the boys in the living room, his heart heavy but resolved. He looked at each of them, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I want you to know, no matter what anyone says or does, we're not going anywhere. This is our home, and we're a family. People may not understand that, but we know the truth. We're going to stand together, no matter what. The boys looked at him, their eyes filled with trust and determination. Noah nodded, his gaze steady. We know, Dad. It was the first time Noah had called him Dad, and the word echoed in Jack's heart, filling him with a fierce, unbreakable pride. They were a family, bound not by blood but by love, by a shared resilience that no one could take away. Together, they would face whatever came next, knowing that no matter what the world thought, they had each other. And for Jack, that was worth more than the acceptance of any town, any stranger, or any critic. The test of strength. As the days turned warmer, Jack found himself busier than ever. Spring had brought in a steady stream of work, and his days were filled with building decks, repairing roofs, and fixing fences around Cedar Grove. His clients were loyal, appreciative of his skill and dedication, and he poured himself into his work, not only because he needed the income to support the boys, but because, in a way, it grounded him. Out on a job, hammer in hand, he could forget about the whispers, the stares, the lingering tension that seemed to follow his family around town. But no amount of work could shield him from reality forever. The growing acceptance he'd hoped for in Cedar Grove had been slow to arrive. And while some neighbors were warming up, others were still reluctant to see his family as anything more than an oddity. For the boys, school had become a battleground, and though he tried to be there for them, Jack could see the toll it was taking. One evening, Jack came home from work to find Noah sitting on the back porch, his face clouded with anger and sadness. Jack's heart sank, recognizing the look in his son's eyes, the look of someone carrying a burden far too heavy for his young shoulders. Hey, Noah, Jack said, easing himself down onto the porch beside him. Rough day. Noah nodded, his gaze fixed on the ground. He was quiet for a long moment before he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know why people hate us, Dad. I didn't do anything wrong, but they look at us like we're not supposed to be here. The pain in his son's voice was like a knife in Jack's heart. He wanted nothing more than to take that hurt away, to shield Noah from the cruelty of a world that sometimes refused to see beyond its own biases. It's not about you, Noah, Jack said softly. People fear what they don't understand. Sometimes they act out because they're scared, or because they've been taught things that aren't true. But that doesn't mean you have to carry their judgment. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Noah clenched his fists, his face twisting with frustration. But it's not fair. Why can't they just leave us alone? Jack put a comforting hand on Noah's shoulder, squeezing gently. I know, son, it isn't fair, but you're stronger than their words. You've been through more than most people ever will, and you're still here. That takes real courage. Noah looked up at him, his expression softening, and Jack saw a flicker of resilience return to his eyes. Thanks, Dad, he whispered, the words still new and precious between them. They sat together in silence, the warmth of the setting sun casting a golden glow over the yard. Jack knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that he wasn't facing it alone. The boys had grown closer to him in ways he hadn't thought possible, and every day he felt their bond strengthen, rooted in a love that no one in Cedar Grove could touch. But their strength would soon be put to the test. A few weeks later, Jack received a call from the local church where the boys attended Sunday school. He had sensed some resistance from a few of the church members since adopting the boys, but he had hoped that, in time, the congregation would come to accept them. Jack, this is Pastor Turner. The familiar voice began, his tone measured but serious. I need to speak with you about an issue that's come up regarding the boys. Jack's chest tightened. What kind of issue, Pastor? The pastor sighed, a sound heavy with hesitation. Some of the parents have expressed concerns. They're worried that the boys' presence might be disruptive to the other children. They're saying that the boys don't belong here. Jack's heart pounded, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. The boys haven't done anything wrong, Pastor. They're just kids trying to learn and fit in. How can anyone think they don't belong? Pastor Turner's voice softened. I know, Jack, and believe me, I've tried to explain that to them. But these parents, they're set in their ways. They're uncomfortable with the situation. I want to support you, but the pressure is growing. I have to consider the feelings of the congregation. Jack felt a surge of frustration, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. Pastor, we're all supposed to be part of the same community here. Isn't the church meant to be a place of love and acceptance? How can we turn our backs on these boys just because they don't fit some narrow idea of family? The pastor was silent for a moment before responding. You're right, Jack, but you know as well as I do that people aren't always willing to open their hearts. I'll do what I can, but perhaps it would be best to give it some time. Maybe a break from Sunday school, just until things settle down. Jack's throat tightened with anger and disappointment, but he knew there was no point in arguing. The people of Cedar Grove weren't going to change overnight, and his boys were paying the price. He ended the call, feeling defeated. That evening, he gathered the boys in the living room to break the news. They listened in silence, their faces a mixture of confusion and hurt. Why don't they want us there? Martin asked, his eyes wide and innocent. He still clung to Jack's every word, looking up to him as a source of strength and protection. Jack knelt down beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Sometimes people are afraid of things they don't understand, Martin. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you or with us. We're a family, and that's what matters. Kyle, who had grown more sensitive to the tensions around them, looked away, his expression guarded. They don't like us, do they? Jack hesitated, choosing his words carefully. It's not that they don't like you, Kyle. It's that they're not used to seeing a family like ours. But that doesn't change who we are. We don't need anyone else's approval to be a family. Noah, who had been quietly listening, spoke up, his voice steady but firm. Maybe we don't need them. We have each other. That's enough. Jack felt a swell of pride as he looked at his sons, their resilience a testament to the strength they had built together. They had been through so much, and yet here they were, standing tall, refusing to let the world define them. Over the next few weeks, Jack focused on making their home a place of comfort and acceptance. He took on a few extra projects to keep his mind occupied, and he encouraged the boys to pursue their own interests. He built a small garden in the backyard with Martin, who loved the idea of growing vegetables and flowers. Together, they planted tomatoes, beans, and wildflowers, the boys' laughter filling the air as they dug in the soil, their hands and faces smeared with dirt. With Noah, Jack worked on building a treehouse in the old oak, a project that quickly became a labor of love. They spent hours hammering, sawing, and measuring, the rough wood gradually taking shape into a small, cozy space that would be theirs alone. As they worked, Noah's guard began to drop, his laughter becoming more frequent, his shoulders more relaxed. Kyle found his own haven in the garage, where Jack had set up an art station for him. Jack watched as Kyle lost himself in his drawings, his pencils and paintbrushes moving across the paper with a grace and confidence that filled Jack with awe. In those moments, Kyle was free, his worries forgotten, his mind focused on creating something beautiful. One evening, as they gathered around the dinner table, Jack looked at his sons, their faces glowing in the warm light of the room. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. They had weathered so much together, and though the world hadn't accepted them, they had found a place of acceptance within themselves. After dinner, they sat on the porch, the cool spring air wrapping around them like a comforting embrace. Jack told them stories of his own childhood, of the games he used to play, the mischief he used to get into. The boys listened, their laughter echoing through the yard, filling the space with a warmth that no amount of prejudice could extinguish. As the stars began to dot the sky, Martin looked up, his voice soft. "Do you think Mama would be proud of us, Papa?" Jack's throat tightened, a lump forming as he thought of Melinda. He looked at each of the boys, their faces filled with love and trust, and he knew the answer without a doubt. "She'd be more than proud, Martin," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. "She'd be proud of each and every one of you, and so am I." They sat together in silence, gazing up at the stars, their hearts full. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that the world might never fully understand them, but they also knew that they were strong, that they had each other, and that no amount of judgment could take that away. For Jack, that was enough. In that moment, he realized that he didn't need Cedar Grove's approval, nor did he need to change for anyone else. They were a family, a real family, and that was something no one could ever take from them. Unbreakable bonds. Summer arrived in Cedar Grove with a burst of color and warmth. The boys seemed to blossom alongside the changing season, their laughter and energy filling every corner of Jack's modest home. Despite the lingering whispers and judgments from some townsfolk, life within their walls had taken on a rhythm of its own, one that felt like home, strong and real. Jack had worked tirelessly to give the boys a summer to remember, determined to show them the beauty and freedom of childhood despite the challenges they faced. He'd spent hours planning small adventures, fishing at the nearby lake, hiking in the woods, and teaching the boys how to build a campfire. Each trip was a chance to escape the weight of Cedar Grove's prejudices, to let the boys be children without the eyes of the town constantly upon them. One balmy Saturday, Jack took the boys to Cedar Grove's annual summer fair, a larger version of the spring festival, but with more games, rides, and even a talent show. He hesitated at first, worried about how the townsfolk might react, but when he saw the excitement in the boys' eyes as they heard the news, he couldn't deny them the experience. The fairgrounds were alive with music and the aroma of cotton candy, popcorn, and fried foods. Bright lights decorated every stall, and children darted around, laughing and tugging their parents toward different rides. For a few hours, Jack felt as though they were part of something ordinary, a family enjoying a day out like anyone else. Kyle immediately dragged his brothers to the dump tank, where a volunteer sat on a precarious perch above a tank of water, daring the crowd to knock him in. With surprising accuracy, Kyle managed to hit the target on his first try, and the volunteer splashed into the water, his arms flailing. Martin and Noah doubled over in laughter, and Jack couldn't help but join in, the sound of their shared joy warming his heart. As they wandered through the fairgrounds, Jack noticed more familiar faces, some offering friendly nods, others avoiding his gaze. A few still looked disapproving, but most of the town seemed content to ignore them today. Jack was grateful for this brief reprieve. He had learned not to let the lingering stares and hushed voices bother him as much, and the boys were learning to do the same. Later, they gathered by the stage where the talent show was set to begin. Kyle's eyes widened as he watched a girl from his class perform a complicated tap dance routine, and Martin's attention was glued to a young boy playing the violin, his fingers moving with practiced precision. When the last act finished, a group of local musicians took the stage, playing a lively folk tune that brought a smile to Jack's face. Without warning, Jack felt a tug on his sleeve. Noah looked up at him, his expression unusually serious. "Dad, can I try something?" Jack raised an eyebrow, curious. "What's that, son?" Noah bit his lip, glancing at the stage nervously. "I want to go up there and tell everyone who we are." The question surprised Jack. He knew Noah had grown more comfortable in their family over the past months, but this was the first time he'd seen him so eager to confront the town's judgment head-on. "Are you sure, Noah?" Jack asked gently. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, you know. We're a family, no matter what anyone else thinks." Noah nodded, his eyes resolute. "I know, but I want them to understand. I don't want to hide who we are anymore." Jack studied his son, feeling a swell of pride. The boy was strong, braver than he'd ever realized. He nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Noah's shoulder. "All right. If that's what you want, I'll be right there with you." They approached the stage, and Jack explained Noah's request to the organizer, who looked surprised but nodded, handing Noah the microphone. The crowd quieted, murmurs spreading as people turned their attention to the young boy standing alone on the stage. Noah took a deep breath, his gaze steady as he scanned the audience. Jack could see the tension in his shoulders, but he also saw the determination in his eyes. "Hi, my name is Noah Henderson," he began, his voice clear but a little shaky. "And these are my brothers, Kyle and Martin. We're here because we're part of this town, just like everyone else. And we're a family." The crowd was silent, eyes fixed on the boy. Jack watched as Noah gathered his courage, his voice growing stronger. "Some people think we don't belong here because we're different. But I don't think family is about looking the same or being what everyone expects. Family is about love. And my dad loves us. He's taken care of us, given us a home, and he's taught us that we don't have to be afraid of who we are." Noah paused, his gaze unwavering. "We're not here to ask for anyone's approval. We're here to say that we're not going anywhere. We're a family, and that's all that matters." Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion as he listened to his son's words. The boy's bravery was a testament to the strength he'd found within himself, a strength that no amount of prejudice could diminish. When Noah finished speaking, he handed the microphone back to the organizer and walked off the stage. The crowd was still silent, processing his words. Jack pulled Noah into a hug, pride radiating through him as he held his son close. Kyle and Martin joined them, wrapping their arms around each other in a quiet show of solidarity. Suddenly, someone in the crowd began clapping, a slow, steady applause that gradually grew louder as more people joined in. Jack turned to see Pastor Turner, a smile on his face as he clapped, his eyes filled with admiration. Others in the crowd began to clap as well, their expressions softening, their judgment giving way to something warmer, more understanding. As they made their way through the crowd, Jack saw familiar faces offering nods of respect, small smiles, and words of encouragement. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start, a tentative acceptance that filled Jack with hope. For the rest of the evening, they enjoyed the fair without the usual stares and whispers. The boys rode the Ferris wheel, their laughter echoing through the night as the ride lifted them high above the fairgrounds. Jack watched them from below, a sense of peace settling over him as he realized that they had taken a step forward, a step toward being truly accepted as a family. As summer drew to a close, Jack decided to throw a small barbecue at their home, inviting a few neighbors and some of the boys' friends from school. It was a modest gathering, just a handful of people, but it felt like a victory. a chance to welcome others into their lives, to show that they were a part of this community. Mrs. Thompson, his elderly neighbor who had once looked at him with barely disguised horror, showed up with a plate of homemade cookies. Carl from the hardware store came, offering Jack a warm handshake and a promise to stop by if he ever needed help with the boys. Even Principal Lawson attended, bringing a small gift for each of the boys, a gesture of kindness that Jack deeply appreciated. As the evening wore on, Jack watched his sons mingle with their new friends, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Kyle was showing off his drawings, Martin was playing tag with the other kids, and Noah was deep in conversation with some of his classmates, his face relaxed and open. Jack felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. They had come so far from those early days, when doubt and fear had shadowed every step. Now they were standing tall, their family unbreakable, forged through trials and love. As the sun began to set, Jack gathered the boys on the porch, wrapping an arm around each of them as they watched the sky turn shades of orange and pink. "You boys have made me prouder than I ever thought possible," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. "No matter what comes our way, remember this, you're loved. We're a family, and nothing and no one can ever change that." Noah looked up at him, his eyes shining. "Thanks, Dad, for everything." Jack smiled, pulling them closer. They stayed like that, watching the sun dip below the horizon, feeling the warmth of each other's presence, knowing that they were stronger than any judgment, any prejudice, any challenge that might come their way. They were a family, not because they shared the same blood, but because they shared a bond that was as deep and enduring as the love Jack had always dreamed of giving. And as they sat together, watching the stars appear one by one, Jack knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would carry them forward, together, no matter what the future held. Standing together, the air had cooled as fall began to settle over Cedar Grove, painting the trees in shades of amber, crimson, and gold. The sound of leaves crunching underfoot and the scent of wood smoke filled the air, bringing with it a quiet sense of change. For Jack and the boys, life was gradually beginning to settle into a new normal. They had weathered the worst of the town's initial skepticism, and though not everyone accepted them, the family had begun to find their place in Cedar Grove. But just as the seasons shifted, so did life's challenges, testing the strength they had built as a family. One Saturday morning, Jack woke to find the house unusually quiet. He walked into the boys' rooms, only to find empty beds. Alarm shot through him until he heard the faint laughter drifting from outside. He peered out the window and saw his sons at the edge of the yard, building a makeshift scarecrow from old clothes and sticks they'd gathered. "Come on, Martin, put the hat on," Kyle shouted, holding up an old, wide-brimmed hat that Jack recognized as one Melinda used to wear during her gardening days. Martin, standing on tiptoe, placed the hat on top of the scarecrow's head, giggling as it wobbled. Jack stepped out, the crunch of leaves under his boots announcing his arrival. The boys turned, their faces lighting up as they waved him over. "Hey, Dad, look at our scarecrow," Noah called, gesturing proudly to their creation. Jack chuckled, examining the scarecrow with an approving nod. "Looks like you boys have been busy this morning." Martin beamed, his small hands brushing dirt off his overalls. "We thought the yard needed something for Halloween, Papa. Now we have our very own scarecrow." Jack felt a pang of nostalgia seeing Melinda's old hat on the scarecrow, but he quickly replaced it with a warm smile. "You did a fine job. This place wouldn't be the same without a touch of Halloween spirit." The boys beamed, and Jack felt a rush of pride. Despite everything, they had grown comfortable, secure in their home. Their laughter, once tinged with hesitance, now filled the air with an easy joy that warmed Jack's heart. Yet he knew that, outside the walls of their home, the world could still be unforgiving. He didn't want to worry them, but he couldn't ignore the reality of the challenges that lay beyond their front door. As Halloween approached, the boys' excitement grew. They spent their afternoons designing costumes with Jack's help, digging through old clothes and gathering supplies from the garage. Noah decided to dress as a pirate, complete with a homemade eye patch and a cardboard cutlass he painted silver. Kyle, ever the artist, created a costume that turned him into a walking canvas, with splashes of paint on his shirt and a palette fashioned from an old piece of wood. Martin, in his innocence, chose to dress as a scarecrow to match the one they'd built in the yard, insisting that he wanted to keep it company. The night of Halloween arrived, and Jack walked with the boys through the neighborhood, watching as they eagerly knocked on doors, their excitement infectious. Most of the neighbors were welcoming, offering the boys candy and admiring their costumes, but Jack noticed a few houses with darkened lights and closed doors. These were homes of families who had never quite come to accept Jack's unconventional family, people who still believed that the boys didn't belong. Jack did his best to shield the boys from these moments, distracting them with stories and jokes as they moved from house to house. As they turned down Maple Street, however, they encountered an unexpected obstacle. A group of older boys, teenagers from the local high school, stood in the middle of the sidewalk, their arms crossed, smirking as they looked at Jack and his sons. Jack recognized a few of them as the sons of people who had been vocal about their disapproval of his family. "Look who it is," one of the boys sneered. "The Hendersons and their family." Jack felt his jaw tighten, a wave of protectiveness surging through him. He moved to step forward, but Noah held his arm, his face calm but resolute. "It's okay, Dad," Noah said softly. He turned to face the boys, his posture steady, his eyes unflinching. "We're just out for Halloween, same as everyone else. If you don't like it, you don't have to watch." The teenagers exchanged glances, clearly taken aback by Noah's confidence. One of them scoffed, but none of them moved. Jack watched, a mixture of pride and worry tightening in his chest. Noah wasn't backing down. He was standing up, not just for himself, but for his brothers and for their family. Finally, the boys stepped aside, muttering to themselves as they let Jack and his sons pass. Jack put a hand on Noah's shoulder, giving him a nod of approval as they continued down the street. "You handled that well, Noah," Jack said quietly. "I'm proud of you." Noah looked up at him, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "Thanks, Dad. I don't want them to think they can scare us away." Jack gave him a reassuring smile. "They can't. We're stronger than that." They continued their trick-or-treating, the incident fading into the background as they collected more candy and enjoyed the sights of costumed children and pumpkin-lit porches. By the time they returned home, the boys were exhausted, their bags filled with candy, their faces flushed with happiness. After they'd changed out of their costumes and settled on the couch, Jack sat down with them, feeling that it was the right time to talk about what had happened. "Tonight, you showed something special," Jack began, looking at each of his sons, standing up to those boys. "That took courage. I know it wasn't easy, and it won't always be easy, but you don't ever have to let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." Kyle looked at Jack, a question in his eyes. "But why don't they like us, Dad? What did we do wrong?" Jack's heart ached at the question, but he knew he had to be honest. "You didn't do anything wrong, Kyle. Sometimes people don't understand things that are different from what they're used to. And when people don't understand something, they can be afraid of it. They might act out, say things that hurt, because they don't know any better." Martin, ever the optimist, looked up with hopeful eyes. "But someday they'll understand, right? Someday they'll see we're just like everyone else." Jack gave a soft smile, ruffling Martin's hair. "I hope so, buddy. But whether they do or not, we're going to keep being ourselves. We don't need anyone else's approval to be a family." Noah, who had been quietly listening, nodded. "We're stronger together. That's what you always said, Dad." Jack felt a surge of pride. "That's right, Noah. And as long as we stand together, nothing can break us." The days that followed were marked by a quiet sense of strength, an unspoken bond that had grown deeper in the wake of the Halloween incident. Jack watched as the boys supported each other, standing up to the occasional unkind word at school, facing each new day with resilience. They had become more than just a family. They had become a unit, each one stronger for the support they gave to one another. One chilly November evening, Jack gathered the boys around the fire pit he built in the backyard. The night sky was clear, stars shining brightly above them as they roasted marshmallows and shared stories, their laughter mingling with the crackling of the flames. "Can we make this a tradition, Dad?" Martin asked, his face illuminated by the warm glow of the fire. "Like every year, we do this together." Jack smiled, feeling the warmth that went beyond the fire. "I'd like that, Martin. This can be our tradition, just us together." As they sat in the quiet of the night, the boys huddled close. Jack felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that they would face more challenges, more tests of their strength, but he also knew that they had built something unshakable. They were bound not by blood, but by the love and loyalty they had forged together. The firelight danced over the boys' faces as they talked and laughed, their voices carrying into the night. And in that moment, Jack realized that he didn't need Cedar Grove's acceptance or approval. They were a family, bound by something deeper than appearances or public opinion. As the flames died down and the stars grew brighter overhead, Jack whispered a silent promise to Melinda, a vow that he would protect and love these boys, come what may. They had faced the world together, and they would continue to do so, unbreakable, unafraid, and united. They were home, and that was all that mattered.